Another question here from the stream. This one's from KD. I'm actually curious to hear your take on this because so KD's asking about resource guarding, and I always find it interesting when I listen to people out of the sport world, especially the protection sports, talk about things like resource guarding. And specifically, she's asking, I think it's a she, could be a he, sorry. Specifically, they are asking about the dog protecting their person. And like, is that like resource guarding, or is this actually like I'm protecting my thing? Are those the same things? Are they different? They are different. How do you distinguish them? But resource guarding, especially in the ring sports, right? Like there's an application where you're actually sort of teaching a form of resource guarding with like the object guard.
Yeah.
And so it's looked at from a very different angle and in a very different form than the kind of work that I would do a lot of.
Yeah.
Which is, just the family dog who's resource guarding in really inappropriate ways. So basically, let's talk about resource guarding. Can we differentiate it from protecting the person, or are they just the same thing? Like any just thoughts around that?
Yeah, you can absolutely differentiate it from protecting the person. Like the application you're talking about in sport work is an exercise called the defensive handler. And I don't see a lot of, and I'm only I'll weigh this against the object guard, which you also said, which I see people aim for a mentality in the dog that they perceive it as a resource that they want to protect and hunker down on. And they're biting or aggressing from a place of, you're trying to take my thing, and this is so important to me that I want it. The defensive handler exercise in ring sport is trained as a biting exercise. So I don't see a lot of, I've only seen a couple people work it with a certain type of dog where they wanted the dog to perceive that the person was being threatened, like in a real way, and that you should start to feel unsettled about that dog and come alive and maybe bite if you feel like your person is being threatened. And then that way it felt like resource guarding. They were saying, this person's important to you. I'm directly trying to threaten the person, not you. And then you should be upset about that and take action. And I've seen that work for dogs that aren't so sporty or gamey. Like maybe their biting's not so good. They're really not wanting to confront a person anyway because they're not secure in that sense. And the way to get them to come alive is to put them in a position where like they're backed into a corner, and that's the only thing that they have to do. And it's not like common practice anymore in protection sports because it's maybe not the healthiest way to work a dog. It's almost like they used to tie dogs out. You like post a dog and you try to flank them, or you try to create like you're ominous towards them. You're creeping towards them and you're saying, I'm a threat to you. You can't get away. So I need to provoke this fight response because there's no way to flee. Nowadays in the sport work, they're like, we're just better at building dogs now. So we make sure that we build their confidence in biting, that they perceive the decoy as like a sparring partner that they can always overcome and be better than. And by the time you're putting an exercise together like the defensive handler, it's more of an obedience than a biting exercise. I lean on this guy's leg, could be my person or it could be any person. It's common in protection sports now that multiple people can handle your dog, especially in ring sport, especially if you're a decoy like me and you end up decoying your own dog, then somebody else has to handle your dog. And so it becomes just an obedience exercise that ends in biting. And so the resource guarding portion of it, I think in that application that you're talking about isn't really there with, and so lean on the person, track the threat. Whenever he comes in and gives the signal, that's when it's permission for me to bite. And then I can fight him and beat him up all day long.
Yeah. And we should probably I probably should have interjected this early on, but for anybody who's not familiar with the sports, defensive handlers and exercise in the ring sports where, you're with your dog or, the dog is with its handler, whoever that handler is, and generally maintains contact with them in sort of a heel position, but sometimes they'll flip around backwards if the decoy, the guy wearing the bite suit's behind them. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but generally the dog is only permitted to bite if the decoy puts their hands on the handler. And I don't know if it has to be in like a certain kind of like forceful way or not, because I know they do like some handshaking exercises and stuff like that. But if they kind of make a quick sudden movement and put their hands on the handler or something of that form, then the dog's permitted to bite. And then and there's probably details there I'm totally missing.
It's okay.
The object guard, again, it's an exercise in the sport work. The dog's given a essentially random object, and they are supposed to stand over it, and they're permitted to bite if the decoy gets within a certain radius of them, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And they have to let go on their own if the decoy moves away. And they have to do all this without their handler present. So the handler's off somewhere else. The dog's working completely independently. Yeah. And they'll sometimes have multiple decoys trying to steal the object. Yeah. And the dog's guarding the object.
Yeah.
Just as it sounds. Okay. Sorry, you can continue now.
And this may be too much for this group, but in Mondio ring, in the defensive handler, 2 hands, it's an audible hit. And then that's when the dog's permitted to bite. French ring, it's just, a swipe of a hand and a tap on a dog. So the different sports have slightly different rules. But so the defensive handler that we just talked about contrasted with the object guard. And what's kind of interesting, at least for me, is in the last 5 or 10 years, I've seen this resurgence and it comes from the way that it used to be taught in, I'd say, France, certainly, but even Belgium, where they want the dog to feel possessive of the object that they're standing over, that the person's trying to take from them. Mm-hmm. And so for when I got into the sport, it was common that it was also treated as an obedience and a biting exercise. So you teach your dog to go and put their feet on something. You do it for food, so they're quite happy to do it. And then they learned that they should be patient and wait on that thing. And so then you teach them to be obedient to putting paws on something, whatever it is, they put their paws on it. And then you would start to insert that behavior into the context of this object guard exercise that you're teaching. So dog learns that if they go and put their feet on something, when a person approaches, once they breach a certain distance, they can go and get what they want, which is to bite them. And then they bite them for a certain amount of time, and the decoy would fight him and say, "Good job for leaving that thing and biting me, because that's what I need you to do." And then the decoy would freeze. And that was the cue for the dog to go back and put their feet back on the thing. And so we trained it like an obedience exercise. But then some of American trainers were going over to France a lot and being inspired by some of the traditional work that was going on over there. And they were watching these guys with puppies at a very young age put food or toys or things that they actually felt guardy about, resources that they actually they wanted, inside a bag or a box. And they would take that box and they would move it from the dog, right? Young puppy, 8 weeks old, 10 weeks old. They'd be like, "Do you want this thing?" And the puppy would be like, "My stuff's in there. My stuff's in there. My stuff's in there." And when the dog was wanting it enough, they would open it up and give them the things that were inside and be like, "Good for you. You should be possessive. You shouldn't let me steal this from you. The more you fight me for it and want to fight me off of it, the more likely you are to, get the pot of gold inside." And so they were trying to nurture this real sense of this is my stuff, and anybody that comes for it, I'm just gonna lynch you, when you get in here. And what had happened then is, so then the dogs get very, possessive of whatever object it is. It can be anything. In the end, for French ring, it's a basket that they're hunkering on, but they feel about this object possessive. They're guarding it. It is a resource. It's something that they covet. And then you put it in the context of this greater picture, which is now somebody's walking in, the dog is really hunkered down on this thing, right? It's a different body language. Instead of standing on it like it's obedience and waiting for a guy to breach a distance, they're like, "This is my dude, do not get close to me. This is my thing." And then a person gets close enough and tries to take it, and the dog goes out and bites them. But it's more like a nippy bite. Bites them and lets go and comes back to their thing right away, and the person has to leave. And that was the interesting side of it, is one of the things when it was an obedience exercise plus biting, one of the things that we were dealing with is dogs weren't letting go of the decoy and going back to their object because they didn't really care about the object. They weren't possessive or guardy of the object. It was a biting exercise. It was I'm just being obedient to this until you breach a distance, which I've learned, and then I can leave and I can bite you. But the dogs from a young age that were nurtured to feel possessive about their thing, the person that was coming in to steal it, they would get close. The dog was reluctant. They didn't really want to leave or let go of it. They just wanted to nip you off and get you away. So it wasn't really a biting exercise. It was just a make distance because I need you away from the thing I care about so much. And you found that dogs that were built that way, they never got drug off their baskets. One of the things that can happen is if a dog gets too invested in the biting, so they're guarding their thing and a person comes and tries to steal it and the dog bites and they go, I don't really care about that thing. I love the biting. Then the decoy walks away and it's not an obedient dog. And you drag them off of the basket and they lose the exercise because they're too
And if there's
committed.
two decoys, the other decoy can come and take the basket, right?
Or the dog is like too unsettled, too eager to bite. So there's a distance that the dog is permitted to leave within. And you can, if the guy that's threatening to steal the object's way outside the permitted distance and the dog leaves too early to bite them, they lose their points because they left too early.
Yeah.
So the dogs that were trained for obedience and the biting, and they really wanted the biting portion of it, they would leave early and bite and lose points, or they would bite and then not go back to their basket. But the dogs that were
trained,
have
the opposite issue with the possessive dogs,
exactly.
where they leave too late sometimes. Like
there's no
penalty for that.
There's no penalty. It's only if you can steal it and take it away from them, or if you can go and put your hand on it and touch it for a certain amount of time, then the dog can lose points because you're actually possessing yourself. But you're promoting that resource guarding, like the behavior, promoting resource guarding, you're promoting the behavior attached to it, which might be like, I'm going to bite you to fend you off of this thing because I care about it so much.
So does the challenge then become, like, in that exercise in the sport, does the quality of the bite matter?
No.
And so, so basically, as long as the decoy is continuing to try to get the resource, the dog has to continue to try to bite.
Yep.
But if the decoy is not trying, they don't care about full mouth, they don't care about the dog holding on the bite for a duration of time. It's just more about what the decoy is doing.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so the only requirement is this, just a nip.
Yeah. Just get the decoy to go away.
Yeah.
So this is actually really fascinating to me. So shout out to KD for asking this question, because I really like this discussion. So in that latter form of this, you are creating the behavior problem that I'm then hired to fix in many pet dogs, right? So the first thing here is, like, if you're going to go down that road, like, you are potentially creating a liability in your dog outside of the context of sport. Whereas, is it fair to say that treating it as an obedience exercise, you're creating a safer dog, not safer than it would be without doing the exercise, but comparatively, you're getting the exercise done in a way that's less likely to create a liability.
Yeah.
Not impossible to create liability, but less likely.
Yep. I think so. And, context is king. So I think that, like, I've seen plenty of these dogs that were trained that way to do the basket, the object guard that we're talking about, and feel possessive about it, that had no trouble with like toys or food or things outside of it. It was just within this certain context, when a person's wearing this costume and you're on this field and, the stage is set, that's when you come alive and feel this way. But they weren't promoting that same behavior, trying to enliven it in other places. And I've seen
keeping it really, really, like, there are sort of initiative cues that say, okay, now we're in a situation where you're going to want to guard your stuff. Unless you've gotten this signal first, you have no reason to be concerned about somebody stealing your things.
That's right.
And you want to be careful about that.
Yeah.
So now let's take this back to the original question. So taking this sort of more traditional approach to the resource guard, where the dog is hunkered over this thing, like you said, the body language is different. This is their thing. They're really trying to defend that, and contrasting that to, again, not the protecting his person as an obedience exercise, but sort of the version of it that you also mentioned, of where, like, a dog might get posted up and learn that they have to defend themselves, and then sort of connect that feeling of self-defense to also my family, my handler, and this person is a real threat to us. And I've learned that when I feel really threatened, the best thing for me to do, and the thing I'm confident in doing, is to bite. So let's contrast those two sort of elements then. Are there differences? So let's start here. Are there differences in even, like, the physical appearance of the dog, the body language of the dog who's possessing the object versus feeling threatened in that moment and getting ready to defend their handler? What's the difference in the dog's psychology, and then how that might manifest through their body?
I think it looks very similar. Yeah, from what I've seen. So if you're saying that the dog that's hunkering down, possessing their object, and the dog that's laying against their handler and feeling possessive of them, is that
not necessarily feeling possessive of them, but the dog who's feeling that that's an exercise that has to do with real threat, not like just an obedience exercise.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a different question too. Like, is this idea of, like, this is a real threat, and it's part of my role to defend my family. Is that different from feeling possessive over the family? Are those two different things? The defending my family versus possessing, because you can make the argument that when they're protecting that object, they're defending the object from being stolen, but it's not, they're not concerned about physical harm to themselves or their family. They're not concerned about safety in that regard. It's more about, it's what's interesting, and I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but it's like when we look at, kind of primary motivations, right? Like there's like acquisition of things I want, and then like staying away from things that could be harmful to me or things that are unpleasant, right? And so the possessiveness has almost more to do with like, this is a thing I want, and it's part of my acquisition of it and maintaining that, right? If I lose this bit of food, I'm not going to die, right? Like I just have to find more food. Whereas when there's a threat, if I don't deal with this threat appropriately, I could die, right? I could be under physical harm. It's a different, right? So there's that different angle of it.
Yeah.
So anyway, but just to kind of circle back around, get off my tangent. So, again, are these different things, this idea of possessing an object versus handling a threat, or are they intertwined in some way where the family becomes an object that's also being possessed?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And to like what you said, how do you know what the dog's feeling? And certain dogs, man, they show up in different ways. Like, I've seen people try to play the possess the basket thing for a dog that just is so open and careless and like doesn't have this feeling of possession within them about something. Like they don't feel like they want to resource guard stuff. They just want to fight people. Yeah. So you play it all day long. He's like, I don't care. This guy comes in, I get to bite him. That's the best thing in the world for me. I know you've been telling me gold's in here and I should be hovering over it, but like that's gold, just biting them. So every dog is really different.
Yeah. But, since we can't, we can't actually get inside their head and know what they're feeling. I guess that's why I was asking about, like, do they present differently in their body language, right? Because that's sort of what we can make our judgment based on. Do you find that those dogs that are trained to see the decoy approaching their handler as a threat, and the dogs that are trained to hunker over a resource, that their body language is presenting similarly in those moments? Or is the dog dealing with the threat more upright and assertive versus kind of hunkering down? Because that may give us, that's really all we can do as far as getting clues, right?
Yeah. Ears pinned back, little haunchier body language. I see it in both exercises where the dog is feeling threat, move away, or I want to possess my stuff. So presenting similar there. And a possessive, like in a different dog, feels possessive, guardy, even ears back, looking like it's a threat, but it's more like, wanting to acquire what's within here. And then in the defensive handler exercise, really forward, even if it's had work where somebody's tried to flank it, tried to make it like a real threat, personal protection dogs, but they're just bangers. They want to fight anyway in that context, even though they can feel differently on the object guard and feel possessive of that. So every dog is different.
Okay, it's probably the last thing I want to ask about this, and then we'll move on. I'm just finding this very personally interesting. So with the dogs that are trained in the defensive handler to treat it more as a real threat, do you find similar things going on? Whereas just like in the object guard, where the dogs who treat it as an obedience exercise, they might be a little bit like, the challenge is making sure they don't leave their handler too soon or bite too early, or the decoy just walks away with the dog attached to their arm and the dog doesn't care about going back, versus the dogs who see it as a threat. Do you see the same kind of thing where they bite, but they're quick to want to get back to their family to kind of keep that ability to keep their family safe? Like, do you see that same parallel there?
Yeah, I do. I see dogs that are more stressed out in the biting. So the one that's been taught like that, it feels like it's a real threat, because the goal would be for the threat to leave. And so if they've been pushed to biting, they might not really want to be there, but they've been forced to be there because nothing else has worked. And so if they're a good dog, they'll stay in the biting, they'll fight until the fight's over, until death or whatever. But in the back of their mind is always like, that was the reason why I did it, versus the dog that has been, taught it's just an obedience exercise and here's your reward is the biting. And those dogs generally find the comfort or like greater resolution, a comfortable resolution in the biting, because that's where they wanted to get to anywhere. And that's where they've been powerful. And I'll tell you this, I used to go to China a lot, and over there, what was kind of funny is the military and the police would come and watch these, and protection sports were just getting started and people were just getting clever with training. And the police and the military would come to these farmers that were training sport work that I'd be working with, and they would offer to buy these sport dogs that looked good. And these sport dogs were being, because they were taking in information from Europeans and from Americans, were being raised like we raise them. We want to make them comfortable in the biting and confident there, and like they're powerful here. We don't want them biting from a place where like they feel like they've been pushed to do it. And if their only response right now that's going to work, it's they love to do it and they love to fight. And so let's just let them have what they want and teach them to be controlled within that, mindful within it, if we can. And that's the dogs that they would bite off, and they would buy, the military, Chinese military and police. And they would always get these really good dogs. They had good training and they had a good balance of like feeling powerful and comfortable in their biting and then solid obedience on them. And it wasn't the same way that I saw, at least early on when I was getting into protection sports like 15 years ago, how like the way that the military and the police procure dogs, they'll go and get the dogs that they'll put them in a defensive position a lot more, because they think that's what they're going to be dealt with. Like that's what they're going to face out there in the street, right? Is somebody's yelling at them and somebody's screaming at them and doing all this stuff. And so they push them to this place too early or really quickly where the dog has to contend with like that onslaught of whatever's coming at them, this person that really makes them feel this way, before they give them the opportunity to go, I like biting. I'm powerful in biting. Nobody's ever been able to beat me there. And by the time you're facing them with like the person that's really, giving them a hard time on the street or whatever, they've seen all of that before. And so these dogs were raised, I think, or confronted with the feelings that this might not be a safe thing, or this might be something that I have to do right now because I'm actually being threatened, versus the sport dogs that are raised properly and think that go, I'm a threat to that person. Like, let them show me whatever they want, but I've dealt with it all before, and I'm actually the threat. Nothing can beat me. And there's just a different mentality about it. And here, I've been thinking about, since I've been down at Lackland, there's a difference between the dogs that are raised in their puppy program here. Like one of the Christina's got one of those dogs, and like not all of them make it, right? 30% actually make it to be operational. So they breed 70 to 80 Malinois puppies a year here, and 30% of those actually make it to be operational dogs. So that's the others that are finding homes, like Christine's got. But they're raising the dogs more like we do in the sport world. They're playing with them from a young age and developing interpersonal play. They're developing obedience right away. They've got outs by the time they're 6 or 7 months old, versus the dogs that they're bringing over from Europe, so that they're farming from Europe or the Netherlands or whatever. And those dogs come in and they're green. They're crazy for their Kongs. And if they've done a little bit of bite work, people have shown them that the bite work is this place where somebody's like, it's always with somebody having a sleeve on their arm, and they're going to come at you and pose like this threat. So it's about the person right away. It's not about the equipment, and it's not about satisfying in the bite and developing this and make the dogs strong and let them possess. There's always somebody behind there that's confronting you along with this activity. And those dogs have it in their head from a young age that I think this is like a real street fight right from the get-go, versus I'm playing a game that I can always win. And at some point, if they're playing a game that they can always win, even when it becomes a street fight, a lot of those dogs, they're unbeatable at that point if you've done your work right. And so they never slip into a head place that can be unhealthy. And some dogs never have a chance to realize that it's a game that they're always going to win. And so they're not emboldened in that sense within themselves. And some dogs, doesn't matter what you do, they're going to feel how they feel about it because of genetics.
Makes sense. Yeah, that's really interesting. And again, similarly, probably fair to say, if you're doing sport work and if you're going down this road, teaching your dog in this exercise that it's a real threat, and doing that kind of bite work, you're opening yourself up to probably a little bit more liability down the line, versus treating it like an obedience and just a biting activity as a game and as something the dog enjoys doing.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you mentioned that about the difference with how the Chinese police and military were acquiring their dogs. I used to dabble in some sport work and bite work, not nearly to the extent that you do, but early in my career, I just wanted to learn about it. I thought it was important to
I'm just a
learn about it.
dabbler too, man. Like I got buddies out there that are like,
Sure.
it's their life. Okay.
Yeah.
It's their whole
Yeah.
life.
But I know at that, and again, we're going back 15 years, but there was almost a sense, because I went to some police canine seminars and programs, and there was a sense in the police world, especially, that like they almost like there was like this competitiveness or ego that went along with, these are the real dogs versus the sport dog. They almost frowned on the sport. Like the sport dogs were lesser than. And I'm looking around going like, these sport dogs are like blowing your dogs out of the water right now.
Sure, yeah.
Like really blowing them out of the water.
Yeah.
But the police were almost, they were very resistant to getting input. And it was guys like Ivan Balabanov, who we mentioned earlier, like, you know, he did some work with police, I know, earlier in his career as well, who started to like at least bring some exposure of like, hey, there's like a way better way of doing things. But yeah, there was almost a competitiveness between the police and the sport world, whereas you're describing in China, whereas the police were like, no, we're going to seek out some of the top dogs from the sport world. We recognize the quality of what's going into the breeding and the raising there.
Yep.
So, all right, cool, man. We went down a rabbit hole there, but that was a cool discussion. So I'm quite pleased with that.